The Black Death was one of the most catastrophic events in European history. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague ravaged Europe, wiping out an estimated 25 to 30 million people, around a third of the population. This single event had profound and lasting effects on nearly every aspect of life in Europe. From social structures and economic systems to religion and the arts, the Black Death didn't just kill millions. It fundamentally reshaped Europe and set the stage for major changes in history. In this video, we'll dive into the Black Death itself, explore how it spread, and examine the far-reaching consequences that continue to echo through the centuries. The Black Death's origins are linked to Central Asia, where it is believed to have emerged in the early 14th century. It was carried by fleas that lived on rats, and the fleas were the primary vector for the bacteria Yersinia pestis, the pathogen responsible for the plague. The route by which it reached Europe was through trade. As merchants traveled along the Silk Road and other trade routes, they unknowingly carried infected rats with them. The plague reached Crimea in 1347, and from there spread to various ports along the Mediterranean. The plague reached the Italian port city of Messina in October 1347, marking the first major outbreak in Europe. By 1348, it had spread to France, Spain, and England, and by 1351, it had reached nearly every corner of Europe. Entire towns and villages were decimated. The plague spread incredibly fast, with some regions losing half their population in a matter of months. The symptoms of the Black Death were gruesome and terrifying. The first sign was typically a fever, followed by painful swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, often located in the armpits, groin, or neck. The buboes would then burst, releasing a foul-smelling fluid. Many people would also experience vomiting, rashes, and delirium. In some cases, the disease spread to the lungs, causing the infected person to cough up blood, leading to pneumonic plague, which was even more contagious. Death could occur within days, sometimes even hours. The Black Death was an airborne disease, and the bacteria that caused it could be transmitted by fleas biting humans, as well as through direct contact with infected bodily fluids. However, during this period, people had little understanding of how diseases spread, so the rapid transmission of the plague wasn't something they could anticipate or avoid. There were many factors that made the spread of the plague so efficient. One of the primary reasons was the dense population in many European cities, where sanitation was poor and people lived in close quarters with both other humans and animals. In fact, rats, which are excellent carriers of fleas, were common in European cities, where they often lived in or near human dwellings. The poor hygiene and the lack of effective medical treatments made it easy for the plague to thrive. Additionally, the movement of people through trade networks helped the disease spread quickly. Merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and travelers all contributed to the rapid transmission. When the disease reached Italy, it spread quickly to France, Spain, and England, often following major trade routes. By 1348, the plague had spread across much of Europe. The speed of the plague spread, combined with the high mortality rate, created a sense of panic and fear. Cities and villages were left abandoned as people fled, trying to escape the invisible killer. Entire communities were wiped out, and once thriving towns were left in ruins. The social fabric of Europe began to unravel as death claimed so many. The impact of the Black Death on European society was nothing short of revolutionary. One of the most immediate effects was the loss of life. The plague wiped out between 25 and 30 million people in Europe, about one-third of the population. Some regions saw even higher death rates, with certain cities losing up to 70% of their inhabitants. The sheer scale of this loss was staggering, and it created a profound societal disruption. The massive depopulation had a significant effect on the labor force. With so many people dead, there were not enough workers to tend to the fields, harvest crops, or maintain the infrastructure. In rural areas, the labor shortage led to a dramatic increase in wages for peasants. This shift in the balance of power between peasants and landowners began to destabilize the feudal system. Previously, peasants had been bound by obligations to their lords, but with a shortage of labor, they were able to negotiate better terms for themselves. Some even left their villages to seek better opportunities elsewhere. In cities, the economic impact was also profound. Trade networks were disrupted, and merchants and artisans faced enormous challenges as the demand for goods and services plummeted. As people died, demand for luxury items, food, and even basic commodities dwindled. Meanwhile, surviving workers and craftsmen began to enjoy higher wages, although their economic prosperity came at a high price: the loss of their family members, neighbors, and communities. The Black Death also disrupted the traditional social hierarchies. With the decimation of so many high-ranking individuals and nobles, some social and political structures began to collapse. Many local rulers were unable to maintain control over their territories. This created opportunities for new powers to rise, particularly in smaller towns and villages, where local leaders could gain influence and authority. The Black Death had profound consequences for religion and the Church in Europe. In the medieval period, the Catholic Church held significant authority and influence over all aspects of life. People turned to the Church in times of crisis, seeking spiritual guidance, prayers, and comfort. However, the scale of the devastation caused by the plague led many to question their faith. Why would God allow such a devastating event to happen? Was the plague a punishment for sin, or was it simply a random act of fate? The Church itself was hit hard by the plague. Many clergy members died, and some abandoned their flocks during the crisis, which led to a loss of trust in the institution. In some areas, there were violent uprisings against the Church, as people accused the clergy of failing to provide adequate help. This breakdown in trust contributed to a long-term decline in the power and influence of the Church in Europe. In response to the plague, some religious groups, such as the Flagellants, took extreme actions to try to appease God. These groups would publicly whip themselves in acts of penance, believing that their suffering would bring about God's forgiveness and end the plague. Others turned to more superstitious practices, seeking out remedies and charms to ward off the disease. The Black Death spurred new religious movements, as many rejected Catholic teachings and sought alternative spirituality. This disillusionment contributed to the early stages of the Protestant Reformation. Figures like Martin Luther gained followers, challenging the Church's authority, partly due to its failure to prevent or stop the plague. The Black Death also had a lasting impact on European culture and psychology. The sheer scale of death and suffering left a deep psychological scar on the people who lived through it. Art and literature from this period reflect a profound sense of despair and an obsession with death. The Dance of Death, a motif in art that depicted skeletons or death personified as a figure leading people to their graves, became a popular theme. This imagery can be seen in paintings, sculptures, and even literature from the time. The Black Death also left a legacy of skepticism. With millions of lives lost, people began to question old certainties. The rigid social and religious systems that had governed life for centuries were no longer taken for granted. In some cases, the intellectual upheaval led to the growth of new ideas, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the early Enlightenment. The Black Death's impact lasted long after the plague ended. It caused a labor shortage, which weakened feudalism and led to a market-based economy. The rise of the bourgeoisie, wealthy merchants and landowners who benefited from this shift, helped lay the foundation for capitalism's development in Europe. The Black Death also spurred changes in medicine. The catastrophic loss of life and the failure of traditional medical practices led to an increased interest in science and the search for more effective treatments. Over time, this would contribute to the growth of modern medicine, although it would take centuries for science to fully catch up with the devastation wrought by the plague. Finally, the psychological and cultural effects of the Black Death shaped European society in ways that are still felt today. The trauma experienced by generations of survivors influenced everything from art and literature to religion and politics. The Black Death was not just a tragic event, it was a turning point in the history of Europe, one that helped to shape the modern world. The Black Death was a pivotal moment in European history. It wiped out a third of the population, reshaped the economy, weakened the power of the church, and caused a deep cultural shift. Though the immediate effects were devastating, the long-term consequences set Europe on a path toward profound change. The Black Death was not just a plague, it was a force that reshaped the course of history, contributing to the rise of new social, economic, and political systems.